we're going to talk about how evolution has shaped human biology, very specifically about sickle cell and malaria. So some key terms: adaptation, that's just a trait that's been favored by natural selection that helps populations be better suited to their environments. Mutation, which we've talked about before, is just a change in the genetic code that creates entirely new genetic material. Again, it is the only source of new genetic material. This is very important. A carrier is an individual who is heterozygous for a trait that only shows up in the phenotype of those who are homozygous recessive. So a lot of times carriers are going to be individuals that don't actually show any signs of a disease, but then can pass it on to offspring. Resistance is the natural genetic ability of an organism to avoid a pathogen. And tolerance is an organism's capacity to survive variation in environmental conditions. So sickle cell anemia, this is actually a natural mutation and adaptation. It is located on gene 11, and it actually affects hemoglobin S, which codes for the production of the protein hemoglobin, which actually assists with the transport of oxygen around our bodies using red blood cells. So obviously this is very, very important for normal bodily functions. However, sickle cell anemia actually causes misshapen red blood cells. They're shaped like sickles. You can kind of see this in this photo here, which can actually have some serious health consequences. They shape like sickles like this instead of like this round kind of like pillow with that divot that a normal red blood cell has. And that round shape of a normal red blood cell and that little divot actually helps them to carry oxygen, but it also helps them to kind of slide through your veins without blocking anything. Whenever somebody has sickle cell anemia, though, their red blood cells take on this sickle shape. So they are kind of like this like crescent moon shape. And they don't have that divot in the middle to help them carry oxygen. They also, because of their shape and also because of how sticky they get as a result of the sickle cell anemia, they can get caught up and kind of stick together more and result in things like blood clots, but also just clogging different veins and making it very hard for other blood cells to get through and carry oxygen through. Now, sickle cell anemia may sound like a very terrible disease, and it is. It can have a lot of very negative side effects health-wise for individuals that have it. However, the sickle cell gene was actually a positive mutation that occurred as a natural resistance to malaria. Malaria is a disease that is spread by mosquitoes. People that end up with malaria, not so much now because we have treatments for it, but a lot of times people that ended up contracting malaria were going to die earlier, which obviously reduces their ability to reproduce. And here you can actually see, because malaria is more present in areas where there are more mosquitoes, one of those being Africa. But here you can see that the areas with the highest rates of malaria actually coincide with the areas with the highest rates of populations with sickle cell. And that is because it is a direct result of the body naturally trying to fight against malaria. And what happens is if you have, so let's say that genotype-wise, you have AA. This is going to be normal red blood cells. These are very susceptible to malaria and the effects of it. We have SS, which is going to be sickle cell anemia. And then we have AS, which is our heterozygous. These are going to be normal red blood cells, but they are immune to malaria. So if you end up being heterozygous for sickle cell, then your blood cells are going to be predominantly normal, and you are actually going to have some immunity to malaria. The problem is if you end up with both genes for the sickle cell, and then you have sickle cell anemia with the sickle-shaped red blood cells that causes a lot of health issues. Here you can see a little bit of a diagram about how sickle cell anemia works and how malaria actually spreads. So it is spread by mosquitoes. When they bite a human, they actually pass these little sporozoites to the host. Essentially, malaria is caused by parasites that mosquitoes carry. And once they get inside of humans, they actually travel through the bloodstream to the liver, where they create thousands of little like daughter cells. And they do not need male or female, they reproduce asexually. And those sit inside of blood cells and infect them. Then they enter the bloodstream, they infect those red blood cells, and eventually they continue to multiply, causing red blood cells to rupture. Once this happens, they spread throughout the bloodstream and just attack more and more red blood cells. Eventually, some of these will actually end up developing into male and females, which can then transfer to other mosquitoes that bite humans. And then it just becomes a very vicious cycle, which is also why malaria is very hard to eradicate in areas that have high rates of it. There is a video about this as well on the additional resources. This week you will also be doing a article review. So you will read 2 articles about sickle cell anemia. They're not very long, I think 7 pages each, roughly. And you are going to write me a little bit of a review on each one. You need to read both and write about both. There is an example of a reading review on Blackboard for you guys to follow. But you really need to just kind of summarize the main points of each article and then try and connect it to things that we've talked about in the lab. You can tell me if you found something interesting or if something confused you, which article you preferred and why. It doesn't really matter. I just want to get an idea of what your thought process is while you read these articles and if they are helpful or not to understanding this concept. But that is all I have for you guys today, so I will see you next week with another lecture.